Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. You're going to listen to a conversation with Victor about Foodshot Global, where we dive deep into taste and the connection to Soil 3.0 and how impact investors can become active in this huge agricultural and also cultural transition. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! So welcome to the podcast. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host, and this time I'm joined by Victor Friedberg, Chairman and founder of Foodshot Global, a unique platform catalyzing food system innovation. Foodshot is an ecosystem of world-class, mission-aligned venture funds, banks, corporate strategic investments, and foundations that make up an integrated capital platform of equity, debt, and non-dilutive capital, and industry resources. And their first focus is Soil 3.0. As you can imagine, this sounds extremely interesting to me, and I have a lot of questions. So let's get started. Welcome, Victor.
Pleasure to join. Nice to meet you.
So you're calling in straight from the airport. That's why the background noise, we're going to do everything we can in editing to reduce it. But so far it's been good in terms of background noise. But the first question, what brings you to soil and specifically Soil 3.0? Because you have a really interesting background story.
Well, first, apologies for all the travel, and my carbon footprint has not been great this week, but I really do try to manage that as well. So I'm happy to speak to you. And yes, I'm very excited about Foodshot Global. We launched it a couple weeks ago at the Global Climate Action Summit. And that's been a multi-year journey for me. So if okay with you, I'll just tell you a little bit of the genesis of the organization.
Yes, please.
So I think it all kind of goes back to an experience I had in Valencia, Spain. I was doing investment mostly in the global development space. I had founded a platform called Launch, which was funded by NASA, State Department, USAID, Nike, Intel, a bunch of other corporations to look at big global challenges, mostly in regards to energy, water, health. And on vacation from doing that work, I went to Valencia, Spain. I went into the central market there and I ate a peach, and I did not recognize the peach as a peach. It tasted something wholly different from what I had experienced in the United States as a peach. It was epiphany of flavor, of freshness, and you could just tell by eating it of substance and nutrition. And I just started wondering, I'm a person of means. I can shop in Whole Foods. I can go to fancy restaurants. But here was a market where people, rich, poor, middle class, all shop together, and we're having communally a completely different experience of food than I was having. So in Launch, I really started to think about investments not from kind of an individual company perspective, but really in terms of systems. What were the systems and how are they organized? What was driving them? What were the incentive systems? Who were the stakeholders? How was that system changing? How is innovation and investment affecting that system? So that when you made an investment, you really thought about it holistically. And here I was having just eaten this peach and suddenly realized that food was a system, something that had not occurred to me before. And as I looked deeper into that system, it became pretty clear to me, and this was in 2011, 2012, that this system was going to change dramatically over the next 10 years. And it was based on that insight that I founded a venture fund called S2G Ventures, Seed to Growth, and co-founded that with a group of like-minded people who had a passion for food, systems analysis, and investment, and developed the thesis around a soil-to-shelf approach to investment. So whether you were investing in a consumer brand, you had to look at how that consumer brand was going to scale over time and what within the system would need to change in order for that brand or that service to get to national or to global scale. So that was going to affect everything from manufacturing, from logistics, from ingredient supply chains, even farm management, and all the way down to the soil. So already just through the work I was doing at S2G, we were starting to think about the relationship of soil as the beginning to what would become the next generation of products and services. Everything was interconnected. And so that was the investment thesis, 30 investments now in that portfolio. And it was in the work that I was doing at S2G that I started thinking about, are there other tools that we could utilize to accelerate the systems change that was going to be needed in food to democratize food so that everyone globally had a baseline food experience and access to nutrition and flavor and culture that was equal. So I was doing that work, and it was like, venture capital is a very specific discipline, is a very specific set of techniques and processes. And it can be even insular as a fund. You can do co-investment with other funds, but start to think that collaboration was another way to approach food system transformation. And it was that beginning. Could collaboration be a new model? Could starting with the problems first be a new model? And it was those two ideas that came together that ultimately led me to found Foodshot Global, which is a collaborative group of investors, banks, foundations, funds, universities, NGOs, nonprofit organizations, all working collaboratively to focus on big global food system challenges and to catalyze capital, non-dilutive equity, and debt to bring the next generation of companies and research to scale. So that's the mission. I can talk a little bit of why we started with soil, but that's the framework by which how Foodshot Global was founded.
And your journey, yeah, definitely we're going to dive into soil. But I'm going to ask a very silly question now to think. Have you ever been back to Valencia or have you ever tasted a peach that had the similar effect on you? Have you tracked down the peach to the soil? Like, have you seen the farmer that grew that peach that changed your life?
No, but that does sound like a good idea. So let's do that. You and I, we'll go to Valencia together.
We should film that. I'm just imagining, I just hope that it's a really nice regenerative farm just for the story. But for sure, we can find another very tasting peach. No, but it's an interesting thing, the taste that you mentioned, the nutrients, and then the soil as we now see, and then we go back to the soil part. More and more, I'm looking at the book of Dan Barber here, and I think his brother and him set up a fund, and I think they're partners of you guys as well, focused on taste, and taste meaning good soil, or good soil practices. Let's keep it a bit more specific. So why soil 3.0? What's because you're going to focus on different focus areas over the many years, hopefully, Foodshot Global is going to run. Your first focus area is soil. Can you explain a bit more the why, but also how you're focusing on that, because it's such a wide topic?
Yes, be happy to. And just a quick note, yes, both Dan and Dave Barber are both friends and colleagues, and I respect their work, both from the Blue Hill perspective and then their new fund, Almanac, but then also this company that Dan has founded called Row 7. Have you heard of Row 7?
Is that the one with the pumpkin varieties? Did I read I read an article, I think, on it. Yeah.
Yes, they started with butternut squash, but
it didn't. That tasted completely off the charts, basically, compared to anything else on the market.
Yeah, that was the prototype for what would become Row 7's mission, which was to basically to breed for flavor. Which, if you think about it, reverses, probably, a half century of processes on hybridization, which flavor was being breeded out.
Yeah. You hoped that it would be part of it, but somehow it wasn't, obviously, as the industry moved to a different set of criteria, mainly transporting yield.
Yeah, the drivers, I think at the beginning made sense in that, food security became the primary driver for the system, efficiency, transportation, logistics, and also cost. How do you bring costs down?
Yeah.
And, coming out of World War I and, the Great Depression and World War II, I mean, you can see why the mindset was of securing calories. And that became the driver, of the system, both on the produce side and on the meat side. But then as that became more industrialized, clearly genetics and farming practices were used primarily on yield. It was the only organizer of the entire, system was yield. And transportation and, I guess, in some ways, longevity. Yeah. So, now, and I think this is the key point, is that the consumer has fundamentally changed. And yes, convenience and affordability and abundance are all still parts of what consumers desire. But now there's another set of attributes, another set of values that the consumer is asking for. And those are around nutrient density, flavor, authenticity, sustainability, regenerative. All of those things are now coming as being forefront for a new set of attributes and values that are driving the system. And I think that is a great progress for the food system and for people who love food as much as you and I and care about the planet as you and I. So I think that's the frame, we have to look at from a historical perspective. But now, and this what sort of leads me to Dan Barber's work at Row 7, is okay, now if you're breeding for flavor, yes, there is a sensory reason why people who eat are going to react positively to that. But flavor is really just a shorthand for nutrients and for micronutrients. And so we've breeded out from our food supply these evolutionary micronutrients in our food supply that have been sacrificed on behalf of yield.
Which is probably why you got this explosion when you ate the peach, like this epiphany, because there was a whole different set of micronutrients in that peach compared to all the other peaches.
Absolutely. And, that you had local ecosystems, or ways in which you could get that product, to market in an efficient way. So at the point of someone biting into it, they're having the best, experience that they can have, with that food. Now, obviously, Europe is different than the United States, and Spain is different than other countries in, Europe. So I don't want to make broad generalizations, but I think that experience is important, and I think it is the direction that we're going. So I, in my speeches now, when I talk about this, I basically say that flavor is a system, right? And that system on the flavor side had broken down because all of the genetics and all the practices for farming were going into yield. breeding the nutrients, out, loading them up with carbohydrates, on the produce side, and also on, the meat side, obviously, much less nutrient, dense. So, flavor, is a system, and it's a system to bring not only these culinary experiences, but these key nutrients that evolution has basically provided for us to do specific human functions of our bodies, and all of that's interconnected.
And all of it starts with soil.
All of it starts with soil. And so you can't have that system work on a nutritional level if it's not working on a nutritional level, on an ecosystem level with the soil itself. So when we were starting to think about Foodshot Global, where were we going to start? I'd like to say that the easy answer was, well, you need to start with soil. That actually took a while for us to get there.
Why is that? What were the steps between, or what were you thinking about, if you want to share, obviously, before as a focus area, and you thought, but actually we should start at the bottom, literally, and with what's under our feet? What were the other options on the table?
Well, I think first, the processes had more to do with that you're now in a collaborative environment across multi-stakeholders. And that's the advantage of Foodshot Global, right? So now you have banks, funds, universities that are doing specific work with, specific expertise, specific, categories, and they need to be aligned. So a lot of the initial work was aligning, short, medium, and long range, milestones and interest areas and strategies to make sure that as a group, everybody felt empowered and invested into a singular effort, on this, year-to-year basis. So, so some of the initial work was purely structural. How do you align a multi-stakeholder group towards a singular purpose? And, we had looked at, in addition to soil, we look at protein gap, which was very top of mind. There's a lot of investment and, work being done, in that. So it was an area ripe for moving capital. And there are a lot of very interesting, companies, many of which, I had the pleasure to work with and invest in through S2G, Beyond Meat, Ripple, companies like that. So, you had to align partners. You had to think about investment horizon. Where is this issue in regards to where capital is moving? And, where can Foodshot Global play a unique role or fill a white space that, maybe other investors are slower to move towards? So we had a lot of discussions of, what were investable areas, what were the horizons for investments and for scale within these sectors, and then where could Foodshot Global differentiate itself and add value to the overall, ecosystem. And it was through all of those conversations that we decided as a collaborative group to focus on soil first. And once you made that decision, you realized, okay, everything is literally built on top of soil. So of course it's the place, to start. But that was not as obvious at the beginning of the process.
Looking back, it's always very easy to guess the lottery numbers and all of that. It makes life.
So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, of course. And can you describe briefly, first of all, Soil 3.0, and also what is the program, or what's the current focus means on soil? What should we connect with you on? What should we send towards? Who can sign up? What are you looking for, and how can we help?
Well, first, thank you and appreciate the help in using your ecosystem to spread the word on Foodshot Global and our work in soil. I think the Soil 3.0 frame, is the way I started to think about it was, Soil 1.0 was, kind of the foundation of agricultural society. And, I think the world of gentlemen farmers and, in which regenerative practices, rotations, cover crops, soil emphasis was already built into how people thought about farming and food and sustainability, although obviously they didn't think about it that way. And then, Soil 2.0 emerged, in my frame, as a result of that historical context we talked about before, where food security, securing calories, focusing on yield at the expense of nutrient density, flavor, regenerative practices became primarily an extraction, practice of nutrients. If you started to think about soil as a bank, we had, nature had set up a system for 1 billion years in which regeneration was clearly part of it. And then in a very short amount of time,
you depleted the bank account.
We basically created a system in which there were only withdrawals and no deposits. And so I think Soil 3.0, the way I think about it, needs to now think about deposits as much as withdrawals and to stem the tide on first a lot of the environmental and organic matter crisis, that we're having. I mean, the stats, and I'm sure your listeners, know some of those, but just the ones that I always think about is that 25% of the world's agricultural soils have been damaged to the point where they no longer can be reliably used for agriculture. 10 million hectares of cropland are lost annually because of soil erosion, and I had heard that translates basically into 30 football fields every minute we're losing in soil. Now we could have a debate whether that's European football or American football, but it's still bad number nonetheless.
We're losing them, we're not getting them back at the moment. Yeah.
And then for every 0.1 meter of soil eroded, we reduce yields 4%. There's 10% loss of yields for every 1 degree rise in temperature. So clearly with climate change, this is only going to get more exacerbated. And then we burn 10 calories of fossil fuel for every single edible calorie. Clearly, that is not sustainable. So if you just look at it from here's what we're doing to the most precious resource on the planet for human civilization, it is hard to imagine any future that has 10 billion people eating healthily and sustainably in which soil is not part of that, future. So, we have to focus there. It's become clear to me that soil is not just the nexus between agriculture and climate change. It's also the nexus between agriculture, climate change, and nutrition. And so I don't know if you had a chance to see or hear about the Harvard study that came out, I think it was about a month ago. And it basically envisions 2050 and a carbon density of 550 ppm. It shows with those CO2 concentrations that nutritional levels of protein, iron, zinc, and otherwise stable crops such as wheat and rice will be lowered 3 to 17%. And based on that Harvard study, the projections of nutritional impacts at 550 ppm are 2 billion people will be deficient in at least one or more essential nutrients. 1.4 billion women of childbearing age and children under 5 will be at high risk for iron deficiency. 122 million people will be protein deficient, and 175 million people will be zinc deficient. So this intersection of soil, climate change, and nutrition, I think, is going to be the generational challenge of our lifetime. And so it just feels absolutely right that Food Chat Global should start there. And to, now answer your question more directly, as I started looking, into this, it became clear that we know very little about soil.
It's funny. It's really, it keeps surprising me every day, but isn't it funny in a, not a very funny way, actually, that the one thing we seem to be completely dependent on, except maybe for a bit of sea nutrients and water nutrients and fish, etc., is soil. And we hardly know what's happening, let alone the interactions between what we're growing on it.
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes is, we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than we know of the soil underfoot.
Yeah, I read that one as well. It's if it wasn't so scary, it would be funny. Yeah.
Yep.
So is that what you're focusing on as well? For to begin to understand, to just how do we? You mentioned researchers as well by shining this light on this very precious dirt/soil underneath our feet. Like, look, guys, we need to. And girls, we need to focus on that. And we don't understand maybe 5% of what is actually happening underneath our feet.
Yeah. So just so your listeners know, that quote, was Leonardo da Vinci in the year 1500. And not that much has changed. And so,
which is sad. Yeah.
So, I think my view is that, almost you can envision in the future that there needs to be a global soil map, right? That basically maps soil quality, nutrient density, almost like we have weather reports and weather, systems that are incredibly detailed in the amount of data that we know, on that. But on soil,
yeah, we know more above, like the few meters or a few kilometers above it. We know incredibly well. We can predict where hurricanes are going to land, etc. And we give them names.
Yeah.
But the few centimeters underneath or feet or inches are completely unknown.
Yeah. So I think, one of the primary things where I think technology, science, and capital needs to focus on is how do we get measuring systems and data systems to start to understand not only above ground phenotyping, but below ground phenotyping. And we're in the early innings of technologies around that. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of what genes are, but we don't know how they really express themselves. And then we think about the plant as, kind of this discrete entity, and we think about, the soil, and we think maybe a little more sophisticated around soil microbiome with more scientific understanding. But that interplay between soil microbiome and the plant, we're just really in the early stages for. So I think we have to start thinking about like a phytobiome, really think about soil and plant as almost like a codependent single organism, and put a lot of science and research into how that works with specific crops, with different soil types and different geographies, with different, sort of pressures coming from climate change. So I think that's one clear area.
Is enough happening there in a sense that, you hear a lot of, obviously, on the GMO side and a lot of, or vertical farming, like technology is going to save it there, but nobody ever mentioned soil, or sort of mentioned it somewhere, are soil-less, or don't worry about it, we got it covered. Not literally, because they would be using cover crops.
Yeah, that would be better if they had.
Yeah, they got it covered. Yes, no, it was a pun unintended, this one.
It was very good.
But there are so many jokes you can make in these podcasts. But on soil, do you see that, like, this vision of don't worry, technology will be fine, and we either grow it in a huge vertical farm, or we'll grow it in a sort of lifeless, soilless platform, and we put our GMO crops on it, and don't worry about it, we'll have this in the next 30 years?
Well, I think my view, again, my frame is...
I know this could open another hour of discussion, and I do realize that. But I want to be conscious of your time. But what do you see there as a soil 3.0?
I think any future that imagines 10 billion people on the planet eating healthily and sustainably will need soil. So all of these other approaches, whether it's, Plenty doing large-scale, globally distributed vertical farms, that'll definitely play a role. I think there's not only room for that, but need for that in the market. But it is not going to replace the need for soil as the fundamental basis for farming and for food. So it is, in my view, techno folly to think about vertical farms, or even, people are starting to talk more about ocean farming, mostly around, different algae and kelp types, for protein isolates and things like that. I think that too has a place, but it's not going to replace the need for soil. And if these other platforms are being invested in with massive capital, I think that's all, great. There will be platforms that can scale and really add value into the market. There'll be a lot of failure. There's a lot of experimentation, going on, but we're going to have to keep going back to soil, regenerating it, creating organic matter, finding crops that really could become more of the staple crops in the future. I think there could be a shift where corn and wheat and soy are not the key crops for the future.
The 80%, yeah.
I think we're going to have to start looking less at yield from a bushels per acre perspective. And I think there will be a time 10, 20, 30 years from now in which the spec is going to be more around nutritional levels per acre, and the crops are going to be more guided on that, in my opinion. So I think there's going to be a shift to different crops that can be more nutrient dense, markets that will develop around that, palates and culinary traditions, that will come from that. And, there'll be, a way in which those crops interact with soil in a much more regenerative way. That's my view. I mean, some of the things in perennials, I think are really interesting.
Very, very exciting. Yeah.
So there's a start of those conversations. They're just the start of regenerative, agriculture. But, last year, at some of the big consumer brand, meetings and expositions, regenerative was a key discussion, point. So it's moving from the periphery into key strategies for corporations. Unilever is starting to do interesting work there. General Mills is starting to do interesting work. Patagonia clearly is very devoted, to this space. So I think we're at the start of that, and we're going to need baseline research and science so that we understand what's going on beneath the soil as well as above the soil. Below ground phenotyping is probably the hardest part of it. The chemical and biological interaction of microbiome and phytobiome is probably worthy of a lot of research, investment. There are technologies on the below ground work. I just came from a group in San Francisco that was arranged by ARPA-E around agriculture. And there's a lot of, LIDAR and different...
to see what's happening underground.
Spectral technologies that's starting to happen underground, some really cutting edge technologies that are being put together, there. Clearly, a lot of work being done on the sensor and the data acquisition side, mostly in terms of predictive analytics for yield, which is, important. But I think also there's probably a lot of these systems are now going to be thinking about flavor and nutrient, density, whether those are Brix levels or protein levels or, different, micronutrient levels. I think where the market is going is that larger corporations, both from being under pressure from the market, but primarily under pressure from consumers who just want better food, that they're going to start thinking about their supply chains in a completely different way. And I think the brands of the future are basically the brands that understand that their brand actually is their supply chains.
And I had a discussion in a previous podcast, and somebody said actually it should be supply webs, because change actually comes from a very difficult past and suggests all kinds of things that we don't want to. But yeah, I
think that's a much better term, and I will use that from now on. But all of the other things that people think about brands, like it's how it's packaged and what colors, are associated and what emotional, they're important. But what really is important for consumers is they're going to look at those labels. They're going to start looking for the cleanest labels possible. They're going to start looking for validation through blockchain that what's on that label is actually what's in the product. And you're already seeing the effects of the breakdown of that trust and that, that equation. You have glyphosate, showing up in trace levels and, Cheerios. You have, you have probably, organic wheat coming in from Turkey and from Crimea that is probably not organic and is going into products that have USDA certification of being organic. And, the consumer is only going to put up with that for a very short amount of time. So these supply webs are going to need to start aligning to all of this validation to clean label. And, to the point where I believe through these data systems, through these embedded networks, through these regenerative practices, that you're going to be able as a consumer to go onto your brand. You're going to be able to trace molecules back all the way to the soil and, know the farming practices on specific farms, when specific crops were harvested, how they were segregated or not segregated along their logistics path, how they were processed. All of those things are going to come together in a digital platform. And unless the soil can be verified, the consumer ultimately is not going to be satisfied that what is on that label and what brands are saying are actually true. So I just think these are inevitable and are going to come faster than we think.
Which is very exciting. I want to ask a final question on the investor side. I mean, you've been gathering this group of investors, funds, banks, strategic investors, foundations, etc. Imagine there's a room full of impact investors, a theater full of impact investors listening to this podcast. Let's imagine it's huge. Everybody's on there. They see Soil 3.0. They've read the books. They want to engage and want to become active. What would be your advice? Obviously, without giving them investment advice, but what would be your advice to where to start if you want to deploy some of your capital, all of your capital, or a big chunk of your capital in this revolution?
Well, I think the near-term, interesting, transformative work, I believe, is being done in transformation from a chemical-based farming system to a biological-based farming system, moving from a data-poor farming system to a data-rich, farming system. So I think those are two really interesting areas. I think there are funds that are being developed. You mentioned one, SLM Partners. I'm an advisor, just for disclosure, to SLM Partners that's doing an organic grain land fund. So buying conventional farmland, converting it to organic, and creating markets for these offtakes for large companies that are really looking to get a head start on regenerative and to get a head start on validation and security around grains being produced in a way that are consistent with the brand promises that these companies are making to their consumers.
Which is not an easy feat. No, I mean, we're in the middle of, I don't know how many pasta scandals we had in Italy so far, but it's number 10 or something, and we haven't seen the end of it, of either imported or contaminated or definitely not from regenerative agriculture. And that's, I mean, as you know, pasta is a huge part of culture, and in many countries actually, and it's just very difficult to find like a proper clean value chain plus any regen activity on the soil.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, interesting area. I think where Food Shot will be focused, will be on, advances in, biological solutions, sensors, but now multidimensional in terms of what they can sense and store from a data perspective, and then predictive analytics, hybridization, especially with the coming changes, in climate. How do you create seeds that are going to be naturally hybridized? Or even, we could have a discussion around CRISPR, as well. But, I think CRISPR is a really interesting, area, especially given some of the dynamics with need for yield, plant health, biodiversity, and climate change. So I think, that's going to be a ripe, area. Visualization systems, whether that is, below ground phenotyping, above ground, LIDAR, microsatellite, all of these, technologies that, together form what I would call soil 3.0, in which all of these together are making the farmer smarter, not only from, the ability to maximize yield efficiently and now do that in a non-chemical way that ultimately is going to have to be a knowledge-based, approach. Chemicals have been, for the most part, have made farmers not have to think more systemically about the work that they do. And, it's still very hard work. There are only so many hours, in the day. So if digital tools, sensors, predictive analytics, monitoring systems, visualization systems can help them in the future to do that more efficiently, I think that will help their bottom line, create more yield sustainably. Clearly, cover crops are going to be important. I think we have to find markets for those cover crops to become cash crops. I don't think just using them solely for regenerative and nutrient recycling is going to be enough. I think we have to find ways to turn that into, profit centers for farmers. So I think there's some interesting work that can be done in that area from an investment standpoint. And then a lot of work in market creation. So, there are companies that are creating markets for insurance that can help regenerative, or organic farms, be more resilient economically and have safety nets under them. Clearly, a lot of work in seed and what are the next generation of hybrid seeds that are being being created for flavor or for, resilience or for nutrient density, or, all of these things are rich and ripe areas now for investments. So I think it's a great time for Soil 3.0 investing.
Very exciting times, yeah. And to final question, I promise. If you could wave your magic wand and change one thing in the agriculture industry from a sustainability or actually regenerative point of view, what would you change today?
That's a really interesting question. And the first thing that came to mind, and it's not sexy, and it's not technology, and it's not, science, and I think this is what we're trying to do at Food Shot global is just the awareness and the education of the everyday, consumer and our human, civilization, that soil is still the centerpiece for this. And, as we're kind of walking through life, the soil underneath our, feet is deteriorating. We can't see it, just like the way, it's hard to see carbon. It's the invisibility that is I think our greatest, challenge. So how do we make the invisible more visible, and to bring that consciousness into everyday life? And once that happens, then change can happen very, quickly. Without that, I think those timelines get pushed out. So if I had to wave my magic wand, it would be everybody waking up, one day and saying and having kind of the epiphany that I had, not at the market in Valencia, Spain, but the epiphany that I had around soil. That was, if we want anything to change, we have to start with the soil first.
And I think with that, we have a perfect end of this podcast. I want to thank you so much. Anybody, I will definitely link all the food shot data below, the website, etc. Anybody who's interested to reach out for to cooperate, to partner, to maybe be invested, I'll put all the details underneath. Thank you so much, Victor. I know this is a not super comfortable timing for you as you have to board a plane, but thank you for making the time, and I'll definitely be checking in as you are going through this focus area of Soil 3.0.
My pleasure, and thank you for the time and your interest in the work we're doing and for the good work you're doing as well.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
You just listened to an interview with Victor. If you're working on anything related to soil, or if you know anyone active in the space, go and check them out on foodshot.org. There's much more information on what they are looking for, how they can invest and grant, and how they can help you move forward. I hope you've learned something about why system thinkers like Victor are moving into the soil space, and of course the connection between soil and good, very complex tastes. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording this podcast since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soy builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.